Now, I think those who have been with ConnCAN from the beginning know that in order to change, in order to reform, in order to improve, we need more than passion and commitment of advocates. You look across history, and you see the great changes and the great evolutions we've had in our society. One of the pieces that is always essential to such change is great leadership. And this year, we saw under the leadership of our governor, great leadership. When you look at what happened in the state of Connecticut, for decades now, we've said that we simply can't make reforms. We've taken on that mantra of land of steady habits. It's just too difficult to change. You've seen other governors that sort of tinker around the edges in other states. We saw a governor who promised us 2 years ago, as Dr. Sharp said, this would be the year for education reform. And when he started this year, he laid forward an agenda that was bolder and more comprehensive than any Democratic state has seen, and pretty much that any state has seen. And when the dust had settled, what did we get? We saw an increase in early childhood education, the number of kids who can go to preschool in the state of Connecticut. We saw a teacher evaluation system put in place that says that student learning matters in evaluating teachers. We saw us addressing our low-performing schools, both through the Alliance districts, where we're turning around our lowest-performing districts, as well as the Commissioners Network, which is targeting those schools that have persistently failed our kids. We saw the single largest increase in charter school per pupil funding that the state has ever seen. And we saw all of this because of the leadership demonstrated by Governor Daniel P. Malloy. When you look historically at what governors have done around education, there are lots of governors that try to take the mantle of education and be the education reform governor. There are few that truly succeed at it. We can look at the history. We can see the Jim Hunts of North Carolina, the Dick Rileys of South Carolina, the Bill Clintons of Arkansas, and the successes that they were able to achieve in moving their states forward, getting them up in the rankings, getting their student performance up. And I think it's safe to say that what we did this year has now put the state of Connecticut on a path to be the true education reform state. We saw real progress, and it's progress I think no one in this room thought was going to be possible. And it was possible because of all of you, but it was particularly possible because of our governor. For those who may have gone to some of the town hall meetings, this was not a pleasant 4 months that the governor and his team endured. When you think of the vitriol, you think of the attacks, you think of the nastiness, not just directed at the bill, but directed at the governor personally. It's enough that many would back down. Many would say, okay, maybe it's too soon, maybe it's too much. And what we saw as a result of this is we saw the governor's spine, if it was possible, grow even more full of steel. We saw him take this on. This was something that he was going to get through, not because it was popular, not because it was easy, but he was going to do this because it was the right thing to do. And he was going to suffer those personal attacks because he knew it was the right thing to do. He knew as governor, if he was serious about improving our state, if he was serious about providing opportunities for our youngest students as well as those moving into the workforce, is he needed to take control, as no other governor in Connecticut's history had, and address education as it needed to be addressed in the 21st century. So it is with great honor that I have the privilege of introducing the 88th governor of the great state of Connecticut, Daniel P. Malloy.
See everybody for that wonderful introduction and perhaps overly gracious. Thank you very much. To Dr. Sharp, who I have seen in action, congratulations on your valedictorian address. Perhaps I, like you, would be a person never to anticipate to be a valedictorian, but you made it before I did. So it's Jamoki is a special place. If you get a chance to visit it in Hartford, you really have to see what's been accomplished over a long period of time in a school district that is rampant with low performance. It is a school that shines extremely brightly, and remember, charter schools are public schools too, so great public schools. Recently, while I'm talking about the doctor, recently I had the opportunity to visit Milner School. To call Milner School a low-performing school is a gross understatement. It was so bad that the former mayor of the city of Hartford, for whom the school is named, said that he was honestly embarrassed and something had to happen to turn that school around. That gave rise to its being included in our list of schools to take over immediately, and also gave rise to, which we fought for in this legislation, the right to have some number of these 25 schools that will be taken over ultimately by the state and put into the commissioners network, to have be able to use charter school models to do that. And the work that has already been done at Milner School, particularly in grades kindergarten through 4 or 5, is quite remarkable. It's a K through 8 school. Some of the older kids whose habits have been set at Milner based on how it previously was run are a little harder to get to, but I think we're actually making progress there. I'm assured that we are. I'll go so far as to say of the 4 models that we're experimenting with in these initial schools that we've taken over, that Milner will post the greatest gains, and they'll do that in the school that was the most challenged of the schools that we actually ended up taking over. So that combination is going to be quite remarkable and send, I think, a very important message about experimentation with different models. But then ultimately, we have to make a decision about which models are the ones to replicate. Which brings me back to this battle that you all and I was involved in this past year on educational reform. The reason we won that fight is we didn't back down from the actual statistics. We have 31 low-performing school districts in the state of Connecticut, educating 41% of our students, and employing a similar percent of our teachers. And yet, and I said this everywhere, I did one of those, I think, 14 town hall meetings, every one of those school districts, those 31, or almost every one, have a higher performing school, and in some cases an extremely high performing school. But the problem in Connecticut, as we've approached education in the past, is we don't replicate our successes, we replicate our failures. And we gave ourselves lots of excuses. Maybe we thought it was too much money, or it was too hard, or the success of that school really didn't depend on the principal and the faculty, but it was the socioeconomic background of the students. What we had to do, and what I think we have successfully begun doing, but successfully on the statute now on the implementation side begun, is to break down that argument. Every student's school can and should be a great school. We're putting more money into it. In this package that we passed, and something that I fought for, is we're no longer simply giving more money to low-performing school districts because it's been appropriated. It will only go to those school districts when, in fact, there's a plan in place for how that money is going to be spent that demonstrates how that money being spent will drive better achievement. Now that is a gigantic break with the past in Connecticut, where what state government has done time and time again when it increased money for schools was to not hold anyone accountable, not hold anyone to an agreement, not even seek such an agreement, making sure that the money was being wisely invested. Little attention was paid to this particular point, but it is perhaps one of the more important points about how we'll fund education in the future of the state of Connecticut. It has to be tied to increases in achievement. Or we need to take over more schools, or change the leadership of districts if they're unwilling or unable to do the things that they need to do. So now let me take a step back. In talking about some of those 31 low-performing districts. Mayor Finch from Bridgeport, who is doing and attempting to do even more great work on the issue of education. His school district is one of these districts that I'm going to talk about. In Bridgeport, New Haven, Hartford, New Britain, New London, and Wyndham, 40% of students in the school system, pre-K through 12, right now, based at least on the way that we used to do things, we're not expected to get a high school diploma. 40%. And the actual value of the diploma that most of the other kids actually received was questionable to begin with. Now, there were some exceptions, but questionable to begin with. We cannot compete as a state with the other 49 states or the rest of the world when we're willing to throw away year after year after year 40% of our students in our urban environment, particularly in a state where the workforce is aging out as rapidly as our own, and where we're competing with other states to retain jobs or attract jobs. This is a matter, it's morally the right thing to do. Any of us who might envision one of our children being impacted by low-performing districts understands the personal side of that, but it is an economic imperative that we actually make the kinds of changes which are called for and allowed for under this statute. As has been mentioned, some of the most contentious points in this entire package was our ability to hold up the mirror to everybody, to students, to parents, to teachers, to administrators, and to local officials, and say, look yourself in the mirror on this one. Do you really believe that 40% of the kids born in Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, New Britain, New London, or Wyndham aren't capable at birth of acquiring a high school diploma? Do you really believe that we've done everything in our power to reestablish and refocus schools that would allow a substantially greater percentage of those children to receive a degree and to have that degree represent something other than social promotion? So what we've done is we've asked the right questions, and we've provided a roadmap to how we get from where we are today to where we have to get, including tying student performance to teacher evaluation and the retention of tenure. Now, this system will take about 3 years to fully implement, but progress is being made, even against some of the most recalcitrant individuals who didn't believe in the discussion that we were having that this could possibly or should possibly be done, are now understanding, as they're beginning to see the work that we're doing within the state and work that's being done in the other states, that it can be done. After all, what I said in a number of those 14 town hall meetings where teachers were standing and I watched the reaction. No teacher wants to work in a building where they can't be proud of the other people working in the building. At least no good person, principal, assistant principal, teacher, wants to be working in a building where other people are not. In fact, one of the most telling discussions I had in the whole year last year was with Randy Weingarten, who's head of the American Federation of Teachers. We had this discussion after she and I had both spoken at a meeting at Central, a different meeting than Dr. Sharp's reference, preparatory to our rolling out our plan for reforming education in Connecticut. And I said to her, and by the way, they didn't know what was coming. I said to her, Randy, the reality is, what we could do is walk into every school building in the state of Connecticut and have teachers rate each other in the building. And I said there would be an 80 to a 90% agreement on who the low-performing teachers are, because teachers resent them in the building. And she looked at me, and she paused, and she says, you're probably right about that. Building a system that will ultimately invite buy-in by teachers because it's good for them, good for the profession, and good for the students that were ultimately the reason that they got into teaching to begin with, is the right way to go. When this system is up and running, and when people understand that tenure doesn't trump everything, but rather performance trumps everything, then we'll make even more progress in years 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. There's so much in this pack. There's literally something that would bring joy to each one of you. If you care about early childhood education like I do, being able to fund in this very difficult economic environment that we're dealing with, 1,000 additional students, and to understand that between the time that this package was acted on in May and October, all 1,000 of those positions had been filled. It's really quite remarkable in a state that is way behind where it should be, given who we are and what we are in early childhood access. But also dollars to study and bring about best practices in early childhood education, particularly to help drive down some of the costs so that we can bring this possibility to even more people. I mean, listen, looking at this crowd, most of us were able to afford for our children a pre-kindergarten learning experience of high quality. What we need to do is build a system that makes sure that that happens regardless of parents' ability to make those payments. Because if you send a kid to school who's already behind, and that child is sitting next to your child in school, whether it's in Stanford or Darien or Westport or anywhere, the teacher's going to have to spend a disproportionate amount of time making up the difference, and therefore take away an amount of time from everyone else's child who may have done that. We target resources, as I've indicated, into interventions and making sure that people are held accountable. One of the more interesting things that we've developed since May is we're actually working with 2 districts on schools that will be taken over next year. There's a planning process underway so that we don't have to begin this in June when the final decision is made. They're working on what their plan to turn that school around will be already. This being built into people's thought processes and boards of education's way of dealing is going to be a very important thing. When you realize that your school is sliding towards the bottom 25, you're going to start doing things before you have to be embarrassed that we've taken over your school, or at least preparatory to making sure that we can accomplish what we have to do in that school, and that school then becomes a beacon for what you need to do in every other school in your district. There are lots of other things that go on. One of my favorite is a literacy pilot where we selected 5 schools in the state. We armed those schools with 5 literacy experts in each one of those schools, and we're studying this year and next what impact that actually has. Because we absolutely know that if we could close the literacy gap in grades kindergarten through 3rd grade, the rest of it will take care of itself. The rest of it will take care of itself by and large. That single ability to have kids end 3rd grade at or near 3rd grade level work will take care of the rest of the stuff that we have to worry about. It's overwhelming. So this experiment, I think, is going to lead to great work being done in our state. I could go through all the changes that are incorporated in this, but actually one of the proudest moments for me as a person who's been involved in public life most of my adult life, from the time I was a prosecutor in New York City through serving on volunteer boards, Board of Finance and Board of Education, and 14 years I spent as mayor, and now closing in on completed 2 years as governor, was when Arne Duncan came to Hartford when we were going to sign this bill. And he called it the most comprehensive single bill on education reform. That doesn't say that we've done all of the things that some states like Massachusetts have done over an 11-year period of time. We have not accomplished all that we need to accomplish. But no bill, at least according to a secretary that we all believe in, has done more in a single step. That's a big step for a state of steady habits to have made. All of which would not have been possible but for your sustained efforts. Many of you have given of your time. Many of you have given of your money. And that's to be appreciated and understood in the full context in which those monies have been spent. We would not have won this issue this year, but for you and other people like you in community after community, but this group in particular, holding people's feet to the fire with facts, with information, but mostly with facts about what we can do when we decide to put our minds to it and put our shoulders to it. And by the way, disabusing people of some of the thoughts that they have about public schools which are chartered. We're not in the business of cherry picking. That's not what we are, and if we ever were, shame on us. But what we're in the business of is picking schools and places that are low achieving and turning them around using appropriate and proven methods to do that. That battle would not have been won without ConnCAN, without other allies in this movement, without dollars spent, without trips up to the Capitol, without people calling their state legislators, as you organized to do. And quite frankly, very often when I was standing in front of hundreds of people, most of whom were yelling at me, I always felt good to see at least one or two faces, and in many cases, many more that I knew in Roy Oki-Grosso, who is on my staff and with whom I've worked for years on a number of issues, was very important to this effort, as was Michael Mandel. I could not have been blessed with a more talented team of people working the political side as well as the educational side. And Stephen Pryor, who has been mentioned previously this evening, a commissioner of education. This is an interesting story. I started talking to Stephen about economic development and a role that he might play in Connecticut. And then I circled back and said, Stephen, given your early work in charter schools and in New Haven, and some of your slightly later but still early work in New York, would you think about coming to Connecticut and being education commissioner? And I have to tell you that this bill was a collaboration between Stephen, his staff, myself, and my staff. And it worked, I think, brilliantly, and you should be as proud as I am, of what we've accomplished together. So final thought. There's much to be done in the future if this is to be brought home as a true success. We have the tools set. We're in the process of changing minds, and I think that process will continue. We need buy-in by teachers ultimately. 90% of children in America are going to be educated in public schools. This idea of it's us against them has got to end over time as we get more and more buy-in, and we will, from teachers, particularly when they understand that they have precious little to fear, and they have a lot to gain by working in a building that they can be proud of their colleagues. We're going to do all of that. We're going to get this job done. And we're going to change the lives of students, not just in the districts that I've mentioned or the 31 low-performing districts, because there's one other thing coming at us. And this is going to be a gigantic wake-up call for everyone in our state and everyone in our nation. Common Core testing is coming. For the first time, we're going to be able to rate ourselves individually as a student, perhaps individually as a school teacher or principal running a building, against every other student taking that test, every other school district taking that test, every other state taking that test. And I have to tell you that what we ultimately have to do is channel this new experience of Common Core testing, 46 states having signed on. It's going to be a shock to a lot of people's systems who believe that their school districts, although not one of the 31 low-performing, are doing an excellent job when they find out that they're not doing an excellent job. There will be more people supporting this cause. There will be more people understanding that change has to be made when that comes about, and that will be a new wind in our sails. Final thought. I see my good friend, Mr. Duggan back there from Domus Foundation. Domus is a group, just so you understand where I'm coming from this on a long-term basis. Domus is